Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. I am Rob, your host, and with me as always, Carter. How you doing, man?
Doing well, man. We're going to be talking about something fun today.
Yeah, life in luxury, huh?
Oh yeah, opulence, if you will.
Big time. All right, this is going to be a fun episode. Before we jump into it, let's say a big thanks to all of our listeners who come every week and listen to the episodes we're putting out. We really appreciate everybody. We want to remind everybody that we do have our social media. We'd love for you guys to check us out there under the same name, Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. Twitter, Instagram.
Yep. Facebook
group.
Yep. Pretty fun group. Post all your food pictures on there.
And wine.
And wine and whiskey. And whatever.
Well, we're going to talk about a subject I don't know a lot about today. I love drinking the bubbles, but I don't know a lot about it. But we have a guest who's going to educate us for sure.
Yeah, on more specifically, champagne.
Champagne.
The king of bubbles.
And we're going to learn and get educated about, the rules and process of champagne. But let's go ahead and introduce our guest. This is Chris Ruhland. And Chris, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, kind of give us a little bit about your background. And anytime we have a guest who has kind of this specific, I'm going to call it an area of expertise. I'm going to say you're an expert in champagne. Kind of how you found that love or that passion for that particular spirit or wine or whatever it might be. Because we come in and start to visit with you here at your place, and you're not, only a champagne guy. I mean, you like the spirit world, and you're into other wines and cocktails and things like that. But you definitely have a big love for champagne.
I really do, and thanks so much for having me on your podcast. Love the podcast, and I'm super excited to be involved in this episode. So, yeah, I guess we all come to these things in different ways, and for me, I really started in spirits out of college and into law school, which is where I went, and I practiced law almost 30 years until recently I moved from being in a law firm to becoming a mediator. But along the way, my wife calls me an extreme hobbyist. So whatever
I can relate for sure.
Yeah. So whatever I get into super deeply. So a while back, many years ago, I started getting into wine, and I always liked wine, but I just didn't understand it as much. And I just had this intuition that if I learned more about it, I could get more joy out of it, essentially. And so I started taking courses. I started taking the WSET courses. Eventually, I got my WSET diploma. And along the way, I also did other courses like the French Wine Scholar and other advanced level courses like that. But mainly what I did is I learned by just really the method of experimenting, right? Just drinking.
So we get to benefit from all of your experience. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I loved it. I like to read wine books. I'm pretty geeky in that way. So I combined my love of drinking and experimentation and taking notes about champagne. Champagne, I do love wines from all over the world, but I just particularly love champagne.
Yeah. There's something fascinating about it.
Absolutely. And there's something fascinating and complex about it in a way that is really mysterious, I think. That's the thing. I think everybody feels like, you mentioned champagne, and the next thing is, okay, joy, right? We're happy.
Yeah.
But why? What's going on? And that's what I wanted to dive into a lot more, and that's what I did.
Well, this is going to be awesome. I do want to make sure that we mention you have a book out, and we need to let everybody know that, if they enjoy this conversation, after this conversation, go get your book, and it'll be a great read. My wife and I have started reading it. We haven't gotten through it completely, but it really is a helpful read for people trying to understand champagne. You'll get a little bit of that today, but I think a much deeper dive in your book.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. This book was a labor of love. This is actually the second book I read. My first book was a legal text that nobody should read unless you're a lawyer. But I just decided one day that I wanted to take what I know about champagne and explain it in a way that is not really academic, not really for the wine student per se, although I think if you're a wine student, you will get something from the book. I wanted to take someone who's like my friends, people who like wine and they like champagne. But a lot of times I would say, oh, here's some champagne. They think, oh, what's the difference between one champagne and another? Other than that, some are expensive. Everybody's heard of Cristal. It's expensive. But what they don't see in champagne, what most people don't see, is the diversity how different champagnes can be from one another. And you can start to experience that by drinking different types. So if you don't understand what's the difference between a Blanc de Blanc, for example, and a Blanc de Noir, just to take one example, you're not going to be able to really calibrate what you like in champagne and understand it. And so my whole goal was to write, as I said in my book, a guide. So a guide for your own personal exploration, not me telling you, hey, here are the best 20 champagnes, go drink those, and here are some others that aren't as good, and maybe you'll have those on a weekday. My goal in this book is to really walk you through a journey through champagne so that by the end of it, you'll have a personal understanding of champagne that may be different from mine. And I think that would be great because we're all different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing, you talk about champagne, and I think before we started the podcast, we kind of talked about it being somewhat of a, there's wine lovers, and then you go champagne. Oof, yeah, there's a lot there. It's pretty intimidating. How would you start a novice to get into starting to explore champagne? Because, if you were just to go out and buy, say, all the expensive name bottles that are out there, I'm sure you'd find them delicious and everything like that, but you just can't do that all the time.
Right, exactly.
Well, let's start with the question. I think some people think that champagne has to be expensive. If it's kind of thought of as that celebratory, or it's an anniversary or it's a wedding thing, and you buy it for those special occasions because it is expensive, and I don't know that that's necessarily the case.
I don't think it's necessarily the case either. I think it's not inexpensive. So when you talk about wines, there are people who are really into finding the best $20 Pinot Noir they can, or the best $20 Cabernet they can. And I think that's great. I do that a lot as well. I think with champagne, the sweet spot for champagne is probably starts at about $40. Once you go below that, I just think you're probably not getting the quality level that you're going to want and get the experience you want. And then it goes up from there. But what I think is most important is you don't have to spend $200-$300 on a bottle of champagne to have an awesome experience. And we're going to drink some champagne today. The first two are between $40 and $50. And I think they're just mind-blowing if you understand it. But I think you're right. That is an initial impression that people have, that it's expensive and therefore should be reserved for a special occasion. But my thing is, if you're willing to spend $40 or $50 on a bottle of wine for a dinner on Saturday night, you have a lot of options. But champagne should be part of that conversation because it's right there.
I agree. And
I didn't mean to leapfrog you, Carter, but I thought, making sure we clarified that it doesn't have to be expensive, then jumping into the top five things or a few things that you might look for.
Sure, absolutely. And, I'm I'm a novice in champagne. I enjoy it, and I think it pairs well with lots of foods. People don't think of it that way, but I guess.
Does it go with pizza?
It sure does. It sure does. Hey, we tried that the other day, didn't we?
We did try that.
Well, it wasn't champagne, but it was Franciacorta. But with pizza, it was great.
Delicious, yeah.
I think it's very versatile.
It is. It's incredibly versatile. But to get to your question about how would you start, I gave that a lot of thought when writing the book, because the book, again, is supposed to be a journey from beginning to end. It's not meant to be a book where you jump into page 40 and then jump back and forth. It's really meant, it's only 170 pages, 180 pages. Start on page 1, end at the end. And so I designed it in a way that really was meant to create a clear path. So the way I started, and I think the way people should start, is actually the way we're starting today with a Blanc de Blanc. So there are three main grape varieties in Champagne. And the first two, everybody who drinks wine is familiar with them, right? Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and then the third grape variety is Pinot Meunier, which is really just a mutation of Pinot, just like all the Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc.
Sure.
Those three grape varieties make up 99% or more of the grapes grown in Champagne. And there are four others that you don't even have to worry about or care about because they just don't matter for the most part, frankly. But so what's a good starting point, I think, is to start with these single varietal champagnes, which I do in the book. And then you get into blends. So for example, and we can get into whenever you want what we got here, but Blanc de Blanc is 100% Chardonnay. And if you go to a wine store, you will see, for example, Ruhland Blanc de Blanc. It's very common, and it's the first wine, in fact, I discuss in the book. It's a great place to start because if you then drink it mindfully, right, you think, okay, this is Chardonnay. What does Chardonnay do? 100% Chardonnay, nothing else in the way. What does it do? You learn something. You think, okay, and maybe try a couple Blanc de Blancs, and then maybe move on to 100% Pinot Noir, maybe move on to 100% Pinot Meunier, though those are more rare, and I don't even think you have to take that step. And then start getting into blends. And that'll be the starting point, and then you can start toying with other aspects that we can talk about of how you would then go through learning about Champagne.
Well, let's go back to kind of, I think when people listen to this, they want to get into Champagne, learn a little bit more about it. I think anytime, I have something and I enjoy it, I like to learn the history of it. I want to know, where did this come from, whether it's a particular wine in that estate or food or whatever it might be. So with Champagne, there's a lot to know about the history of Champagne. Can you give us a little bit of that?
Sure, I'm happy to. And to me, as a wine drinker, the history is interesting. And probably somebody like me that's more interesting, because again, I'm pretty geeky about those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But I always, on a topic like that, I always want to say too, let's look at the history that matters for today and what's in our glass, in the sense that, some of this, you can go through all the historical facts and then it doesn't mean anything anymore for the average drinker. But with that said, what I think is interesting about the history of Champagne is that wine has been made in Champagne for many, many hundreds of years. And so it's a very important wine region, putting aside sparkling wine. And what happened about 300 years ago is that Champagne and Burgundy were really in a competition for the court, the wines of court, right? And what is the king's favorite wine, right?
Yeah.
And essentially, Champagne lost to Burgundy, and that meant that, and of course they were making some very similar wines in a lot of ways. And at the time, what the king drank mattered.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
and so serendipitously, around the same time, the laws in France changed. It used to be that you could only ship wine in barrel, which really would prevent you from making a sparkling wine, unless you can just have people show up at your cellar door and drink it. And about 300 years ago, the law was changed so that you could ship wine in bottle. And that was very important. There were some other changes that happened, technological changes that happened around the same time too, strength of bottles and that sort of thing. And so that's when the Champagne houses got started. So Champagne Ruhland, which we just mentioned, was the very first wine house in Champagne to devote itself exclusively really to sparkling wine. And then after that, a number of them popped up that still exist today. And Ruhland, of course, now is owned by a big company, but be that as it may, what I think is true about Champagne is that the region just has a lot of experience with making this stuff, and that's important,
Yeah, absolutely.
A question I have, and maybe you can kind of expound upon it, the bubble concept, how did that begin? How did that get perfected? What's the history there?
It's really interesting. The bubbles at first in sparkling wine were considered, let me back up. Bubbles were considered a wine flaw at first, before they were considered something desirable, which is really interesting. It's like a lot of things. I compare it to Post-it notes. Post-it notes were a mistake. Somebody was trying to create a strong adhesive and create a low-tack adhesive. But the way that it would happen would be you'd have a fermentation would start and the wine would be bottled, but the weather would turn cold. And in the spring, when the weather warmed up, you'd open the bottle, and there were bubbles coming out. And the problem had been that there had been a fermentation that hadn't been complete, because cold weather had chilled the bottle before the fermentation could complete. And so people would open up these bottles and say, "Oh, this is terrible. We screwed up here," But eventually, it just kind of caught on that there's something to this that's desirable. And I think what's really desirable to me is the texture. I think bubbles are an incredibly important part of champagne, not just because they look nice, and they are beautiful, there's no doubt, and they make you laugh and smile when you look at them, but bubbles are a feature of champagne that are meant to integrate with the entire wine. I don't know if I got off track a little bit in talking about that, but I just think, and I say that because, and again, to each his own, you can take your bottle of champagne, do whatever the heck you want with it, and it doesn't matter to me, but there's this trend of a lot of people decanting champagne, and some people like it that way. I don't, in part because you're going to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the liquid, and you're going to reduce the bubbles. And so
that's what keeps it fresh.
It provides the texture and liveliness on the palate. And bubbles are different. Like if we look at these bubbles here in this glass, they're super fine, and that's partly because of the champagne method. If you take other sparkling wines from other regions, and again, not to trash them because there are a lot of sparkling wines that are just meant for different things.
Sure.
Like Prosecco is meant for something else. It's not
Mimosas.
really meant
Mostly orange juice.
Mimosas. And it's a great point. Prosecco is great in mimosas, and I don't think champagne is.
Yeah.
But in any event, the bubbles are a very important feature.
Let me ask you this: is champagne the where it all started? I mean, it was sparkling around anywhere else before champagne?
Sparkling wine started before champagne. There's a town in France called Limoux, and there was a wine called Blanquette de Limoux, and that was really the first to be intentional about it, though they didn't create it the same way. They did it through that, what's now called the ancestral method, which is what I was just talking about. They would intentionally take the wine where they knew it hadn't completely fermented, bottle it, and then knew that in the spring it would warm up, it'd re-ferment. Of course, an offspring of fermentation is carbon dioxide, but now it'll be trapped in the bottle. And so
things happened.
Exactly. Yeah. And so they knew that would happen, and there are still wines today made in that ancestral method. And I think it's kind of interesting. Champagne's not made that way. Champagne, the bubbles get there from a totally different process. But the short answer is sparkling wine was not invented in Champagne. It also was not invented by Dom Perignon, something that, is completely a myth. And,
come on.
Which is funny because you would know that from some of the marketing materials you see out there. But in any event, what happened in Champagne, I think, was just a significant exploration into the methods of making sparkling wines, and a lot of the advances, the technological advances in making sparkling wines in this method. You call it the traditional method, you can call it the Champagne method, are all coming out of Champagne.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind, the process. I think it's interesting. A lot of people who drink champagne may not understand, that second fermentation and how that process works. And I think it's interesting to, they put that beer cap, I'll call it a beer cap on it for that first.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. One of the things that struck me about champagne too is how complicated it is to make.
Yeah.
In a way, it provides the opportunity to have some kind of reverence for the wine because it's complicated and it's also easy to screw up. So there's a lot of risk involved in making champagne. But the very short version of making champagne is you make a base wine like you make anything else, but this may be too technical, but you press the grapes differently because what you don't want color.
You don't crush them.
Right,
Yes.
You don't crush them, exactly. They're gently pressed to get the juice. And then you make a base wine. And by the way, they press in whole clusters, which really is going to require hand harvesting instead of machine harvesting. And then once you make this wine, you're really making a lower alcohol wine, an 11% alcohol wine. And then you go through this second fermentation in bottle. And in fact, the bottle we have right here is the very bottle where this second fermentation took place. It doesn't take place in a tank, and then you pour it into the bottle.
Right.
And so what you do is you put the base wine in the bottle, and then they just add sugar, yeast in a particular formula, and also what they call a clarifying agent that's going to help get the dead yeast cells out of it later. And of course, anytime you put sugar and yeast in there, and then you put a cap on, you're going to get another fermentation, right? And so what you're going to do is you're going to raise the alcohol level up to about 12.5%. But now, what happens to that carbon dioxide? It's stuck in the bottle. And so that's how you get the second
So here's what I want to know. What's the magic of getting that cap off and the cork and cage on?
Yeah. So, and what's interesting is it's even more than that, because when they take the cap off, they don't just take it off and then put a cork on. They put something else in. And this is what's called the liqueur d'expédition, or the shipping liquor. And this is where you put in, because when you take the cap off, a couple of things are going to happen. It's done very rapidly by machine now, frankly. There are some people who still do this by hand, but for the most part, there are advanced machines that do this. But the cap comes off, you're going to lose some wine and some carbon dioxide. So what you do is you're going to put a little bit of extra wine in the bottle before the cork comes in.
Oh,
Okay.
But with that, and we can get into this too, traditionally you're also going to put in sugar, dosage, a little bit of sugar. It's a fairly small amount. Now, some producers now are selling zero dosage champagne, also labeled as Brut Nature, where there is no dosage. But the traditional thing is to put some amount of sugar. We talked about this is how you would make it sweet if you want to make it sweet. In sweet champagne is really not a significant element in the marketplace today for most wine drinkers. So we have dry champagne. So why do we have sugar? Well, they add sugar to balance the wine. It's really, I talk a lot about this in my book because I'm pretty passionate about this subject of no dosage. People say, oh, well, if it doesn't have sugar, it must be better or healthier or something.
Yeah.
Well, there's hardly any. We're talking about, like, in this is what, 4 grams per liter of wine, 4 grams of sugar per liter of wine.
It's probably half a tablespoon.
Yeah,
if that.
it's tiny. And so, but what they do is, these champagne producers will do what are called dosage trials. They'll sit around and take this and try it with different levels of sugar just to see what works the best for their wine, not for somebody else's wine, or what tastes the best. And what the sugar does really is it does 2 things. It cuts the acidity a little bit, provides some balance because they're super acidic wines, so it provides balance there, and then it also helps develop some secondary aromas later on.
Yeah. So talk about the acidic wine part. Now, to my understanding, because of the climate that's there, because of when you pick the grapes and these kind of things, you're creating a more acidic wine. So you really need that dosage to a certain degree in there. But talk about the whole process of, like, the grapes, the harvesting, that kind of thing. Why is this unique?
Sure. Yeah, and I mean that's one of the great things about champagne. I mean that's why champagne is better oftentimes than sparkling wines that are made in warmer regions. It's a cold climate, but they do get enough sun. And of course, in grape growing in general, no matter what wine you're talking about, what you're trying to do is ripen the grapes over a long growing season and eventually harvest ripe, healthy grapes. And this is why you plant different grape varieties in different areas, right, depending on the climate. So Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier are typically what we would call early ripening grapes. So something, this is obvious, but something like Cabernet Sauvignon would never get ripe, most likely, in Champagne. It just wouldn't have the time, not enough sunshine, not enough heat. So these grape varieties will, under the right conditions, and if there aren't terrible storms and there's enough sunlight and heat, ripen to the point where when you harvest the grapes in the fall or early or late summer, early fall, what you're going to get is grapes that are ripe in the sense of their flavor profile and their health, but they still have very high levels of acidity. Mm-hmm. And that's what you want in a wine like this.
Sure. Sure. Well, another thing, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as French wine goes, Champagne is very unique because it's one of the few wines where you can blend white wine with red wine.
You're absolutely right.
Well,
it's
aren't they both
interesting.
white wines?
Well, they're both white wines, but white grapes and red
I'm just
grapes.
kidding.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, you said something just now that was correct in terms of rosés. So
True.
Rosés are all over the world. You have still rosés. They're typically made they're not made by pouring red wine into white wine.
Just so the listeners know, when you say still, we just mean wine without bubbles.
Correct.
Yeah.
Still wine. Yes. Thank you. And so, but here, most rosés are made. We're literally taking a red wine and pouring some of it into a white wine to change the color and the flavor and the texture. And that is very unusual. It's not allowed anywhere else in France.
Wait, you're actually pouring the red wine in until you reach a color that you want.
Yep. That's how
So
most.
it's not a blending, or it's not putting the two blends on the skins to get that color. It's actually already been colored and you're pouring it in.
Right. There is a, that's the way most rosés are made. Now, some rosés are made, a minority of rosés in Champagne are made a different way. If you've heard of the Saignée method of making rosés, where they do actually macerate red grapes on their skins and then bleed off the juice, and then it is colored juice. But mostly what they're doing is the same process we started with, where they're pressing gently to get a white wine, and then they literally just take red wine and add it to the white to make
That's
a
interesting.
rosé.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, I did.
You did. Well, you're an expert as well. So.
No, not at all. No, but I thought it was an interesting fact because, normally that's an odd thing.
It is.
That would be not something standard. So, yeah, it's kind of cool.
I do want to talk about a little bit of the what we're drinking, but before we let you dive into that deep, I do want to say that the yeast strain on this one is fantastic. Is there another wine that I could get with that same yeast strain?
Funny. So you read the book.
People don't know what I'm
exactly.
talking.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
See, you thought you knew a lot.
Yeah.
What do you think about that yeast strain?
Smells nice and bready. I like that.
yeah, it's funny. What you're referencing is what I talk about in the book is there are different dimensions you can cut across in looking for different types of champagne, and some are just too ridiculous for anybody to try to figure out. Nobody's going to tell you what yeast strain they use. So, and it wouldn't matter anyway if you knew what it was, because if somebody used the same strain in a different champagne, it wouldn't mean that it tastes the same. So there are lots of things I talk about in the book that I just think are more accessible in terms of being able to really compare one champagne to another and say, okay, I like this, I don't like this as much, or what have you, and then go out and find other champagnes that are like that.
Yeah, that's funny that you say that about the yeast strain thing, because I used to brew a lot of beer, like an incredible amount of beer, actually, and couldn't drink enough. I was giving it away a lot of times. But, you can buy the yeast strains to, for your beer, like in a home brewing store or something like that. But like these breweries have been cultivating this yeast strain, even if it's the same strain, it's had some mutations to it just over time, because they keep capturing cultures and reconstituting it or whatever it is. And so even if you were to say, I'm going to make the identical beer to this brewery's beer, it probably wouldn't be identical because that yeast strain has changed over time.
Yeah. And there are, the truth is there are commercial yeast strains used in champagne that are specific to sparkling wines, because the second fermentation is a unique environment. So there are certain yeasts that thrive better in that. But it's interesting, but it's just not not helpful to the consumer.
Yeah,
but I know you
sure.
knew that. So,
When I read that, I thought that's a great point. But I told my wife, I go, I'm going to bring that up. Ask about the yeast strain. So what are we drinking, Chris?
Okay. So this is a champagne that I mentioned in the book. It's Doyard Cuvée Vendémiaire, and it is a Blanc de Blanc, so 100% Chardonnay. It's made by a grower. It's in the premier cru village of Vertou. It's where it's made. And I think we should just taste it and see what we think.
Yeah, sure.
And this is something that would be available at big box stores or your.
It's hard to tell. I mean, I think we'll get into a couple others that are probably more available. This is be less, but you can definitely find it if you look.
All right, cheers, guys.
All right, cheers.
Delicious.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's really good.
I think a lot of people who drink champagne as novice, not people who are really into champagne, just think you pour it and drink it and the bubbles are cool. But it's a wine.
It
You
is.
can nose it. You can pick up things on it. You can really, let it open up and enjoy that as a wine.
Absolutely, and I go through the same process really as with any other wine in trying champagne. I may not swirl it as much in my mouth as I will another wine, but I still do. And I agree. If you look at it as a wine, I think that's the best way to do it in terms of your enjoyment of it. And so this champagne here, and the reason that I thought we would talk about it is that it's really a great example of a Blanc de Blanc from the Côte de Blancs, which is where most of the high quality Chardonnay comes from in Champagne, and it's really just got that combination of this lightness. You get really Chardonnay type, really suppressed Chardonnay, delicate flavors. Maybe some apple and lemon and things, but then also it's got the bread and biscuit and dough to it combined.
It does have that.
And it's just a great. This is, I think, one of these, and again, a more accessible one in terms of finding it would be the Ruhland Blanc de Blancs. It's just, this is the kind of thing that if you want to know what Chardonnay does in Champagne, this is a great example. And you can see it right here in this glass.
Well, and I don't know, some of the more expensive, not that they're the best, but some of the more expensive champagnes are Blanc de Blanc champagne.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very expensive champagnes. I mean, way out of most people's, my price range are Blanc de Blanc champagne. So it's no joke as a category for sure. And but I think this texture too, there's a richness to this champagne.
It is. It's rich, but the acid cuts through really well and balances it out. I really, really enjoy this a lot. I would drink this any day.
Me too.
So you made me think of a question that I think about in red wine a lot. You're talking about how expensive that could get. Is there for you, of somebody who really enjoys champagne, is there a kind of a law of diminishing returns? That.
Yeah, and frankly, I think there is in wine in general.
That's red wine for sure for me.
Any wine there. The other day, I was very fortunate that I did not pay for this bottle of wine, but somebody opened an 82 Aubryon, and it was
that's big wine.
It was amazing.
Somebody just opened it.
Yeah, well, fortunately, I was invited to a dinner where somebody brought it, and a very generous person brought this wine. Now, would I pay what he paid for this bottle of wine? No, but this was somebody who had the means to do it, and it was amazing. So, but then it's gone,
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I still can taste that right now, and so it's weird because with any bottle of wine, I just think there are diminishing returns. I once bought. I will admit that I once bought a $2,000 bottle of champagne. And I did it it was my birthday, and I knew it was this most expensive bottle of wine I bought by far. It was really, really good. Was it $2,000 good? Probably not.
Yeah.
But it goes to the memories of that birthday
Yeah,
and that wine.
it does.
And I think you and I have talked about that a lot, Carter, that a lot of it is, the memories you're creating with when you're drinking whatever you might be drinking.
Yeah, and you never forget that.
No.
It's particularly if you're with friends too.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
exactly. But all I will say, so as I said in the book, I do think that to get to your point, so I gave a range in the book of $40 to $200, and I just think that consistently, if you're in that range, this is a $45 bottle of champagne that's amazing. At $200, you're talking Cristal and some vintages, maybe Cristal's pushing it a little bit more, especially with inflation. But you're talking about some really incredible champagnes. But honestly, at $500 and $600 and $700, there's some great wines, but what if they're not? You know, it just starts to become a risk.
Hey, they had that Ace of Spades for $1,000 a year and a half ago or whatever.
And they're a relatively new producer.
Well, so it's one of these things where I just think that over $200, I guess your term was the best. They're diminishing returns.
Yeah.
So there might be returns. It's just that I'm not sure that
is it enough to justify.
That's the issue. It depends on, and of course it depends on your level of income, assets, and willing to spend on this particular hobby. It's funny because I do happen to spend a lot of money on wine, but on the other hand, I don't want a boat. You know, some people have other hobbies or whatever, and it's just, this is mine.
We don't spend a lot on wine or whiskey. We try to make sure it's very...
Okay. Right? You know, here's the problem. Okay, maybe you spend a lot of money on wine. But
we make friends with people who spend.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Maybe you don't spend a lot of money on wine, or you do spend a lot of money on wine and not other things. Me, I spend a lot of money on wine, whiskey. Now I've gotten into scotch. Now eating out.
Your wife.
She's, believe it or not, she's kind of low maintenance from that perspective. But like, you start getting all of these hobbies, and you're like, holy crap.
Well, you got to remember, Chris is into those same things. So
Actually, can I ask you guys a question about this? Because I know this is not my podcast, but because I know you know a lot about bourbon. I love bourbon. I've been drinking bourbon a long time. But to me, bourbon is a spirit that I don't think should be really expensive. And and so maybe you tell me, where do you see diminishing returns in bourbon?
I think
about $60.
Yeah, you know... Okay, here's my opinion on it, okay? I have spent some money on bourbon, for sure. I would prefer to buy something $70 or under, and I feel like it should be available, but the hype has just gotten so big.
The problem with the bourbon world is, and if this exists in the wine world, I don't know about it. I know that you can buy wines in groups, you know, from people who have them, things that maybe you can't find. In the bourbon world, it's actually a secondary market.
I know.
And so so I say $70 because, you know, if you're going to get a Stag Junior, no longer a junior, it's just a Stag.
Just Stag, whatever.
You know, you pay $65 for it at retail, and it's a solid bourbon, but now you want, you know, $300 for it on secondary because it's hard to find.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's worth that. So, but I also say the craft world. I mean, I understand they totally have a lot more expense in trying to produce what they're trying to make versus some big distiller. So their costs are a lot more, and that reflected in their product. But it's hard for me to pay $80 for a bourbon that might be a craft distilled, or it might just be from MGP, and they just slap their label on it and want twice the price. So whiskey's kind of a different...
One thing I'd say, like if, you know, somebody were to ask my advice on this, try before you buy, and go to a bar. If you want to invest and say, hey, I want to go buy a bottle of GTS on secondary or something like George C. Stagg on secondary, go to a bar, pay the $50 for a pour, and decide if that is earth-changing, life-changing, whatever, enough for you to go out and spend $1,000 on a bottle of whiskey.
That's a great idea.
And the reason I say $60 is because, Carter, tell me if you disagree, there's just an enormous amount of whiskeys that are made by some of the big distillers that are just great whiskeys at a great value at $60 and under. There are some limited releases that come out annually. Would I pay for it, like a George T. Stagg or a William LaRue Weller for $100 to $130, retail? Absolutely.
If you ever found it at $100, you would get it.
And that's my point. You're not going to find that. So I'm going to spend my dollars where I know I'm getting a great product for the biggest kind of bang for my buck.
Well, from me, even as somebody who does buy on secondary markets pretty frequently, there are some even secondary buys. Like some of these Four Roses picks that are like 10, 11 years old that are like $200 or $175. Yeah, it's
exclusive.
It's over like what the retail market is, but it's not like triple, quadruple the retail price. It's more like double plus.
We're gonna have to do another show with Chris on bourbon.
Yeah, no, it's great. No, it's really interesting because I think there are some parallels. I'll say, first of all, before I tell you what I think the parallels are in Champagne, I used to go years ago, I just liked Blanton's bourbon. I just liked it. And I could go to Bevmo, where I lived, and it would be just on the shelf, $45 or whatever, no big deal. One day I show up, it's not there. And then what happened to it is just insane. And so to me, I think Blanton's is great, but I think it's great at $50. But I don't think it's great at the secondary market prices.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And Blanton's, believe it or not, is one that doesn't go up that much. Most places now retail sell it 65 to 70, and it's $100 on secondary.
$120 on secondary, something like that.
So, but to your point, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Wine is that way too, and Champagne is in the sense that, so for example, Pierre Peters is a very good producer in the Côte de Blancs of Chardonnay, Blanc de Blancs. And I've been drinking Pierre Peters champagnes for a while. And then I started noticing every time I listened to a podcast about Champagne, or I'd read somebody talk about their favorite growers in Champagne, invariably Pierre Peters is mentioned as, oh my gosh, you've got to drink this. And, good for the house. That's great.
Yeah.
They deserve it. But the prices have just marched up and up.
Oh,
and
yeah.
up. And so, there definitely are these parallels where it becomes a thing to drink among the people who know.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a thing to know about. And again, I have mixed feelings about it because I'm happy for the people who are successful in making great champagne and being able to charge prices for it. But at the same time, it's a little weird because there are so many good champagnes out there. We don't have to be stuck on the one star,
Yeah.
We had this kind of conversation like when we were talking about Rhone Valley, and we were talking about like Chateau Beaucastle. For some reason, that's like a thing in Houston.
Everybody,
really? Everybody's into Chateau. And I'm like,
it's a solid wine.
It's a solid, a great wine.
Yeah.
But I just think to myself, there are other wineries in Chateau Neuf de Pape, like that you can choose from that aren't Chateau Beaucastle.
Yeah, but we said that, and then we proceeded to open like a 97, 98, 2000.
I enjoyed it. Yeah. but anyway.
Go ahead.
No, one thing I was going to ask about this wine, and so Premier Cru. Maybe talk about like that.
The different levels?
The different levels there.
I'm glad you mentioned that. There's another topic that I get pretty worked up about in my book, which is this whole idea of Grand Cru and Premier Cru. Unfortunately, I think it's just very deceptive. I just think that these terms shouldn't be used, and they're used in a way that really is confusing to the consumer, and the consumer believes one thing when something else is true. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So if you go to Burgundy, for example, there's this hierarchy that people are familiar with, or a lot of people are, and it's a reign of vineyards. Now, whether the reigns are all correct or not, that's a whole other story, and there are people who are expert in that. But you might say this vineyard is a Grand Cru vineyard for Pinot Noir. This is a Premier Cru vineyard, and this other vineyard over here isn't either one. And so you have this understanding as a wine drinker that, if I'm drinking Grand Cru Burgundy, I'm really drinking the great stuff.
Yeah.
If I'm drinking Premier Cru, it's a level below, and if I'm not, it's a level below that. Not that always works out exactly that way, but there's this like rough justice there that goes on, right? In Champagne, it's completely different. The short story is that Grand Cru and Premier Cru are terms that showed up in Champagne a little over 100 years ago, not to rate vineyards at all. They were to rate entire villages, but it was about this commercial solution, because what you have in Champagne are all these champagne houses who buy grapes and make the wine. And then you have all these growers who grow grapes but don't necessarily make wine. And they had to come together every year and make deals. And it's incredibly complicated. There's just a lot of moving parts and a lot of transactions. So to ease that situation, they both agreed, they say the growers on the one hand and the houses on the other hand, to create this system called the Échelle de Crus, or a ladder of growths. And it was just really very rough justice on villages. So they'd say, okay, this village, Vertu, is Premier Cru. And that means that you're going to get 90% of the price. If I call it a 90, give it a score of a 90. I think now at the end it ended up 95, but let's call it a 90. You're going to get 90% of the price of a Grand Cru grape. So if you are in Auger, in the Côte de Blancs, which is with Grand Cru, you get 100% of the price of Grand Cru grape. And that just eased the transactions back and forth. So there wasn't this micromanaging of vineyards and grapes every year. But it was never meant to rate wines. That's the most important thing. It never meant to say, oh, look at a bottle of wine. It's Premier Cru. That means it's not as good as Grand Cru, but it's better than something else.
So it makes me ask the question, can those designations for those areas change?
Not anymore. That's the funny thing. They did for, again, about 100 years until the EU decided these are anti-competitive agreements. And so it got busted up. And so now all grape prices in Champagne are like anything else. They're negotiated between buyer and seller. But what they did in France is they decided we're going to allow villages that were Grand Cru or Premier Cru at the end of time, so to speak, when this system ended. There were 17 Grand Cru villages, 42 Premier Cru. If you make your wine from grapes, 100% from Grand Cru grapes, you can put Grand Cru on the label. And if it's Premier Cru, if it's from Premier Cru villages, you can put Premier Cru. And so what's odd is you could really make, if you wanted to, and it happens, you could make bad wine that's Premier Cru or Grand Cru, but if it's from a village, and by the way, we're talking about entire villages where the vineyards are differently situated, there are different quality levels.
Soils are different?
Soils, yeah, aspects to the sun, ripening. You could take the worst Grand Cru grapes from some village, make crummy champagne, and slap a Grand Cru label on it. Meanwhile, you put it on a shelf, and the consumer looks in and go, "Oh, quality. That's Grand Cru champagne. That must be
amazing.
Great." Yeah, and so I just think it's incredibly deceptive. The practice should end simply because it's just not fair to the ordinary consumer.
So you're basically telling the listeners, don't pay attention to it.
Yes, that is what I'm saying, and I think you have to go behind it. Now, obviously, there's some really good Grand Cru champagne. There's some really good Premier Cru. By the way, Cristal is not Grand Cru champagne because it has grapes from one Premier Cru village that was a 99% at the end of the day.
Oh, my gosh.
And they can't call it Grand Cru, and they don't want to call it Premier Cru, so they don't. Dom Perignon's not Grand Cru champagne because, again, they're taking from different villages. So it's really silly, honestly, when you look at what goes on in the marketplace between, really expensive champagne that's not Grand Cru, less expensive champagne that is Grand Cru, and I just think it's confusing.
Yeah, and it brings up a good point. When you make that statement there that they're not Dom Perignon, it goes to show you that the quality grapes don't all have to come from a area that is designated Grand Cru. They know that some of the better grapes are in this Premier Cru area that are going to make their champagne fantastic.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the more famous vineyards in Champagne, it's a single vineyard wine, Clos de Goisse, you may have heard of it. That's from a Premier Cru village. It's one of the greatest, champagnes.
Yeah.
So yes, I think the main thing is to explore mindfully, and just to understand that the scheme of Grand Cru and Premier Cru is not somebody saying in Champagne, oh, this is a better wine or a lesser wine. Just if you know that, you're just better off, I think.
Yeah, I think it's very misleading, for sure. And one thing I was going to ask you, since this is we're talking about certain things that are on the bottle, when you see, Premier Cru on there. So talk a little bit about vintage wine, vintage champagne. Talk a little bit about the Clos, like the single vineyard champagnes, like some of the things. I guess like with the vintage champagnes, we've talked about this. Are they always better?
No, They're not. That's the other thing that is, I think, very confusing. And again, I try to clarify this in my book and really explain it in a way that is helpful to the consumer, I hope. So all it means for a champagne to be a vintage champagne is it has to really meet two requirements. One is 100% of the grapes that went into that bottle of champagne came from the stated vintage year. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. The other is that the wine stayed in the cellar of the producer for 3 years after tirage. So that process we talked about starting the second fermentation, putting the sugar and the yeast in the bottle and putting the cap on it. From that point on, you start counting in champagne. And a non-vintage wine can be released onto the market 15 months after that date. And a vintage wine has to wait 3 years. Now, that's it. That's the sum total of the difference between the legal difference anyway, right, between vintage and non-vintage champagne. Now, in reality, there are differences because typically a vintage champagne by a producer they'll use better quality grapes from the vintage year. Typically, they'll age the champagne on its lees longer. They'll have more autolysis before disgorgement, but they don't have to, right? So, again, I wouldn't say that the vintage designation is deceptive because it's accurate. It's telling you that it's from this vintage year. It's just that the impressions that people have from seeing other wines are misleading. So I think we're used to seeing vintage wines for everything else, right? If you're talking about any wine from Bordeaux or from California, you're looking for a vintage, you're looking for age, you're looking at how good was that vintage year. If you don't see a vintage on, let's say, a Pinot Noir or a red wine, what do you think about it? I mean, you're thinking there's something going on here. It's probably low quality, but some of the most expensive champagnes, again, Krug Grand Cuvée, for example, is not a vintage wine. Now, Krug has a vintage wine, but Krug Grand Cuvée is one of the greatest champagnes that there is, and it's not a vintage wine. And in fact, the history of champagne is all about really making non-vintage wines. Vintage wines and champagne are a fairly recent phenomenon in the history of champagne, and in the development of champagne, you used these reserve wines from other vintages to build either a consistent style and we get to the next wine, Charles Heidsieck is a non-vintage wine. It is intentionally made with old reserve wines to create a style. They don't want in this wine it to be a vintage wine because they're giving you something in this wine that they really couldn't deliver from a vintage wine. They're giving you old reserve wines, and I could talk about that.
I read that in your book, and you talked about the average in the, I forget, what was the bottle? The average was 5 to 15 years, but the average was right at 10 years.
Yeah.
And I was going, man, that's some great age going into that bottle versus a vintage wine. But I wanted to say, when you talk about vintage on a champagne bottle, for a guy who likes wine and thinks about wine, just still wines a certain way, to me, and tell me if I'm, silly for thinking this, I thought the vintage meant that the winemaker said, these grapes, what we've got this year is absolutely fantastic. So I don't need anything else to help with this. It's going to go in and you're going to be blown away by how good this is. Kind of like going when you get a wine, say, in Napa, and it's a single vineyard, an estate wine. And you go, okay, if all the fruit's coming from this area, I'm expecting it to be pretty good.
Right. So it's different. And we can talk about the single vineyard concept because I think that's something that is important to understand as well. And I think it's misunderstood. But again, the vintage wine, it's simply saying it met these legal requirements. Most of the big producers, and frankly, most champagne comes from big producers, let's be honest. I mean, 90-plus champagne you see is from the big houses. They're making a vintage wine and a non-vintage wine. So they'll make a non-vintage wine every year. They won't make a vintage wine every year because there's some years that they just aren't good in terms of the weather that year, right? But in years that they make both, they're really just different expressions, And the vintage
so it's
wine
not that one is supposed to be better than the other.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Again, it's typically, again, from the bigger houses, it is true that the vintage wines will be more expensive. But they, in a sense, they should be, because there's more risk going into them. There's that longer period of longer aging in the cellars, which is expensive. These bottles are taking up more real estate and time in the cellars, and they're being aged longer. So it's understandable, but one of the things I think is really important about wine in general and champagne is that we shouldn't always worry about what's better. You know, I'm looking for what's different and what's interesting. But I know a lot of people, they go to the shelf and they go, okay, which one's the best for $60? What's the best champagne for $80? And I think, it's kind of sad. Do we have to care about that? Why don't we think about, hey, I'm having shellfish. What would be good with that? Or, or you know what? I've never tried 100% Pinot Meunier before. It's $45 or $50. Let me go see what that's about. And that's why, yes, there are times when I think, okay, what's the best wine I can open tonight? But most times that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, what do I feel like? What's most appropriate?
That's what I was going to say, what your mood is.
Yeah.
We know some people that open really, really expensive bottles of wine just to say that I opened a really expensive bottle of wine.
You know people like that?
I do. Me, I'm just like, whatever, man. If I can find a good value, or if something that I can just open on a weekday, great. I mean, that's fantastic.
But the flip of that, too, is my wife will go, it doesn't matter that it's Tuesday. If you feel like drinking a nice bottle, let's open it.
I'm all for that. I mean, I'll tell you, I totally agree. In fact, I have a theory that we probably are doing things backwards. So we take a celebration. It's somebody's 50th wedding anniversary, and you open the best wine you can. Oh, it's like, oh, hey, I loved being with you for 50 years, but this wine is amazing. We're taking attention away, whereas if it's an ordinary occasion and it's ordinary food and it's regular dinner conversation, maybe we can elevate it with a really nice bottle of wine.
I like that a lot.
All right. Well, another thing that you mentioned, and I think it's kind of unique to champagne, but like maybe I'm wrong, I'm not sure, is the process of holding back stock. That's
the reserve.
Reserve. Is that unique to champagne?
So it's not unique to champagne in the sense that there are other sparkling wine regions in the world that make wine the same way champagne does. So something like Trentadoc or Franciacorta, where they're making traditional method champagnes, and there you would see the holding back of reserve wines. But it is an essential part of the non-vintage style. I put an asterisk there because there are some non-vintage champagnes, meaning champagnes that don't have a vintage on them, that are actually from a single year's harvest. And the reason for that is that there are some, especially smaller producers, let's say they just don't have a lot of grapes, but they want to make champagne. They may throw in all their grapes from 2012, make the champagne they can make, but they don't want to hold it in their cellars for 3 years. So they can't meet that second legal requirement. So they may hold it for 2 years, but because they didn't hold it for 3, they can't put the vintage on the front label.
Gotcha.
So that's why when you go to a restaurant and there's a list that says multi-vintage, I think, is it all multi-vintage? Really? Is that the right term? It's really not. But in any event, it's the use of reserve wine serves a couple of important, at least probably 3 important purposes in champagne. One is it's a tough climate, so there's some years where you may need them, right? Yeah. Second is you can create a consistent house style, right? Because you know what you have, and you're not going to create a wine that's identical every year. It's not like a spirit where we're looking for absolute identity and consistency, but we are looking for some house style. And then the third is we'll see, and maybe we can open up this Charles Heidsieck because it really shows this directly in the glass. The third is because, think about it, they can give you in this bottle old wine that you can open tonight. You don't have to age it. You brought it home from the shelf. They aged this reserve wine for 10 years, mixed it with some current vintage wine, And then now you take it home from the store and you've got all this richness and depth in a non-vintage champagne.
No, that's cool. That's really cool. Very unique.
Yeah, it's certainly, and that's just one of the things too, when you get into champagne, there are these complexities, and I think the issue is, and I think you brought this up earlier, at first they just seem impenetrable, but really they're not. You just need to know a few basic things to get them.
I think I like champagne too, because it is, number one, it's unique, but number two, it's almost like, biochemistry, science, like a lot, you've got a fermentation, you've got a second fermentation, you've got,
It's the maker's mark of wine.
Oh man, maybe. But anyway, I'm really enjoying this wine. This is great. I'm
letting you guys talk as much as I'm not. I'm shutting up so I can enjoy my glass. Of champagne.
It's fantastic. So okay, I want to talk about something that is definitely on my list here. What is the most raisin bottle that's out there?
Dom Perignon.
Is it Dom Perignon or is it Cristal?
Now you have to preface that question with we did an episode on
wine taters.
In the whiskey world, there's a term, a whiskey tater, a bourbon tater, which is people who just kind of, and we've all been there. We're not saying we're still there.
Definitely been there.
We're always a tater in the whiskey world, and I think same would probably apply in the wine world. But somebody who geeks out over something, or maybe us as being in the hobby for a little bit longer, we go, yeah, he's a tater because we've been there. We did that before. We're past that. We've moved on. But you just kind of chuckle at certain things, getting excited about, I got a Blanton's. Good for you. Whatever.
Yeah.
And so we kind of took that and said, how does that apply in the wine world? There has to be what we, that wine tater, and we came up with the term, the wine raisin. And I think you said you listened to the episode.
I did. I love the episode.
That's where Carter's getting that question from. If you haven't heard that episode, go check it out, because I think it's fun to just kind of talk about and make fun of ourselves.
And it's probably a nice segue to one of our points in the wine.
I think we'll do that with the next glass.
Yeah.
With the next bottle.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I thought about that because I listened to what you said, and I thought, is there some analogy in champagne? And I actually don't think there is. I think there is something, though, that I'll tell you that relates to it. So it's funny. A lot of the champagnes that people might think, oh, they must not be really great because they're so popular. And you mentioned Dom Perignon, Cristal. The fact is, Dom Perignon is a great champagne. Cristal is a great champagne. So as much as they've got all this popular press, and Cristal is mentioned in all these rap songs and all this, the fact is, if you just pour it in the glass and you taste it, you will see that there is a reason that these are considered great. But what I do think is interesting in champagne is sort of this, reverse raisin thing going on, where, if that makes any sense,
I like it.
Which is, you have champagnes that, if you're smart and sophisticated, know champagne, you're too good for certain champagnes because you're the one who realizes that, oh, the general public likes these, but that's only because they don't know very much. There's that sort of thing that definitely goes on in champagne. And I think the one, to my mind, that fits the bill to the highest degree is Veuve Clicquot.
Yep.
And Veuve Clicquot is just funny because if you don't know a lot about champagne, you go to a restaurant, you see it, you think, oh, it's so great. You see the yellow label and you're really excited. But there's this weird stage of wine geekery where you supposedly advance past that. And now you've had all these grower champagnes and you've had so many different things. And now those people, silly them. They think Veuve Clicquot is a good champagne, and really it's not.
Yeah.
I think there's a next stage to go to where you really actually examine that champagne with an open mind. It's actually a very good champagne. And I defy anybody, bring me a bottle, get some glasses, and I'll show you. And you try to tell me that this is not quality champagne, I'm not going to say it's the very best. I'm not going to say it's equivalent to much more expensive bottles, nor am I even going to say that it isn't overpriced. It probably is a little overpriced because of the fact there's so much demand. But I drink that champagne every day of the week, frankly.
I think he makes a great point.
Oh, yeah.
When you talk about Blanton's or Weller 12 or some of those things where, to your point, in the whiskey world, guys think that's beneath them now when it's still a very solid pour.
I really like the Veuve Clicquot, like the rosé that they have. It's really, really good. And I've seen people even on like some different wine pages just totally crapping all over Veuve Clicquot, and I'm like, it's not bad. You know,
No.
I don't know where this perception has come in, but
Well, they're further in their journey.
I guess. but
Well, should we take a break and we'll pour that next glass?
Great. That'll
Okay,
be
let's
great.
do that. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back with a new beverage poured in our glass, and we'll let Chris tell us kind of what we have here.
Sure. So this is a different champagne in several ways. So this is Charles Heidsieck Brut Reserve. And Charles Heidsieck is, of course, a big champagne house. And what's interesting about this is a blend of grapes. So it's not a rosé, it's a white champagne. So, but it's Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier blended. But when we talked about reserve wines, and we talked about non-vintage wines, when you buy a bottle of non-vintage wine, it may contain very young reserve wines. Moet Imperial is a great example, something that we've probably all had. The style of that calls for very young wines, very young reserve wines. This is somewhat unusual in that this has reserve wines going back 10 years. And so the proportion of reserve wines is still 40% reserve, 60% of a current vintage year. And I think it states the current vintage year on the back, or the base year on the back. By the way, the back label is very interesting on this. It contains a lot of information. But it says that there's an average age of 10 years of reserve wines, which is really just ridiculous at this price point.
10 years,
yeah.
I mean.
$45 a bottle approximately. And so my point earlier, and we can talk about what's in this glass, you go to the store, you pick this up, you drink it tonight, okay? You don't have to lay it down, and they already did that for you with all these reserve wines. And what the reserve wines do, if you smell this and taste this, they really create this mellowness and richness and complexity in this that you don't see in champagnes with younger reserve wines.
I haven't nosed this or anything yet. What do you think?
Oh man,
What do you think?
I like it. I like it quite a lot. Definitely, it's less as the previous wine. Less of that yeasty quality to it. It's got more of the to me like
Freshness and brightness to it.
And pear, but it also has almost some kind of like a barnyard quality to it, like a little wild.
Yeah, and it's got a lot of body to it. And I think the other thing is where Chardonnay can be linear and precise, this is just really rounded out, And again, I come back to the word mellowed out, rounded out. It just feels like it goes down almost like a thicker beverage, if that makes sense.
Well, to me, I'm getting more the like an apricot, like more of the kind of a dried intense, thing going on.
This is different for me because I'm not getting as much on the mid palate as I am on the back of the palate.
Yeah,
where it's
for sure.
I mean, just great back there.
Yeah, you're telling me.
Whoops.
I thought you were going to eliminate that one.
My wife wants me to.
I'd say let it go.
It's a classic.
It's a classic. No, this is really good and very different from the first wine.
It is. And so the differences, again, would be in the grape varieties, the mix of the grape varieties, and, again, this use of really old reserve wines. So these are just some things that we start to talk about when we look at differences in champagne. And so to your point, you just said this is very different from the first one. They're both clearly champagne, right?
Yes.
It's not like you pick this up and wonder, where is this from or what's this about? But they're different, and that's really one of the main things that I like to evangelize about is that there really is an extensive palette out there, that you can find in champagne.
So I want to ask the question. I think people novice who drink champagne, me included, don't think there's necessarily a lot of, wine making that goes into champagne. I think I'm being educated that there actually is. That, when we think about white wines and red wines, we don't want to give too much credit. Obviously, the fruits are the star, and I've always heard the winemaker's job is not to screw it up. But they still have a part in playing to put something really good in the bottle. And I think a lot of people might think that's not the case in champagne, but I think it really is.
Well, I think even more so in champagne, frankly, for a couple different reasons. First of all, let's be honest, champagne is a man-made or human-made processed wine. You cannot make champagne without human beings. You could, in theory, make still wine without human beings, have grapes crack on the ground and
Hot
yeast
sun
come and you got wine. But with champagne, it requires a lot of technology, things that human beings have to do to make champagne. It will not make itself. And so there's a lot of winemaking that goes on in champagne and a lot of decisions that have to be made. I mean, just look at this particular bottle of champagne. How many decisions had to go into this? What vineyards to take the grapes from? What blend of grapes? What blend of reserve wines? Which reserve wines, right? How long should this sit on its lees? All sorts of things like that go into it. Should it be fermented in stainless steel or aged in oak, or what percentage? All these things. So and dosage, we talked about dosage. For example, Charles Heidsieck is a house that they're very clear. They believe in using dosage and using sugar to create richness and balance and harmony in their champagne. They're not part of the, we don't want dosage crowd at all. In fact, their winemaker, I saw a seminar that he gave where he said something like, the wine tells us the truth, something like that, like how much dosage needs is the wine tells you how much it needs. But really what he's saying is we do all these trials and then we figure out what tastes the best.
Yeah.
The point is, champagne is a highly produced wine that requires a lot of skill on the part of the winemaker. And at any course, some decision can get made where things go sideways. That's the first thing. And the second thing is with lees aging, with autolysis and the wine sitting on its lees, the dead yeast cells.
Talk about that
maybe we haven't talked about that. So we talked about the fact that there's a second fermentation, right? And what happens in the second fermentation is more alcohol is created, and there's carbon dioxide. And then the question is, when do you open this up and do the disgorgement, right? And in champagne, a wine has to age at least 12 months on its lees, but usually it's much longer than that. And what happens is a process of autolysis starts where enzymes work on the dead yeast cells to create amino acids and proteins that change the flavor profile of the champagne. So it's a really interesting step that happens in champagne that really changes the character of the wine depending on how long you age it on its lees or what you do there. And that goes hand in hand with these grape varieties because Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, they're not aromatic grape varieties. And that's one of the reasons they work so well is they don't compete with these bready, pastry, doughy flavors. They really complement them. And that's what I think what you can see here is that you get the bready, doughy, pastry thing. I definitely get it. But it's the Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier are working together to complement those flavors into one flavor profile.
Okay, that makes sense. Can we, at this point, I think you kind of asked the question earlier, Carter, if a wine novice is wanting to explore the world of champagne and they go pick up a bottle, what are 3 to 5 or however many you think are some things they need to be aware of on the front of the label and on the back of the label?
Yeah. It's a great question, and one of the disappointments of champagne is that there's just no uniformity in labels, and it's terrible because if only there would be at least 5 things, like you asked the question, assuming there are 4 or 5 things you could expect to see. Unfortunately, there are not, and some provide no information. Some provide, they tell you, what the base year of a non-vintage wine was, like this does. And the first wine did as well. Sometimes they tell you what the dosage is. Sometimes they don't. I think the main thing, the people who really are into champagne, their main gripe with a lot of producers over the years has been producers who don't put the date of disgorgement on the label in some way or another. Because that is very important to people like me who pay attention to that. Because when you look at disgorgement, and again, that's the point where we pop open the cap, get rid of eject the dead yeast cells out of the wine, replace some wine, put some sugar in it. That's the date of disgorgement, right? That's considered to some extent the born-on date of the champagne, but in a different way than beer. So beer has this, some of these beers have born-on dates, right? And what they're trying to tell you there is, okay, it's been born, drink it pretty soon or it's going to go bad. That's not the issue in champagne. Your champagne's not going to go bad. But the issue is that there is development in the bottle, like there is with all wine, right? After that date of disgorgement, that's different from the pre-disgorgement development. So, when you buy a Bordeaux from, let's say, 2015, you know roughly when it was bottled, right?
Yep.
And then you start making decisions about when you want to open this, and how long do I want to age this, and maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong when you open it, but at least you have some reference point.
Right.
And the disgorgement date is really the reference point, because I like champagne that's been disgorged at least a year and a half before I opened it, and because I want that bottle development. But I like it even more. I like extended post-disgorgement bottle aging in champagne. On the other hand, I don't want too much, because at some point there's pressure on this cork that could potentially create the risk that I'm going to open an oxidized bottle of champagne. So it's a long way of saying that if you see a disgorgement date, it's something to pay attention to. I think the reluctance over the years of producers has been they're worried that people will look at it as a sell-by date or a spoilage date, and consumers will be confused. And my issue is, I think, let's get over that, or educate consumers, or do whatever you want,
Right.
Now you have producers like Louis Roederer, they'll put a code, a QR code. We'll see that in this next bottle. If we open that, it'll send you their website, and they'll talk about it when it left its cellars, and they can then provide you whatever information they want to provide you, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's the key thing is to look for is the disgorgement date.
And so if it's not on the bottle, do you have a resource that, we hear a lot of people talking about, whether it's Wine Spectator or Cellar Tracker or Vinvino?
Unfortunately, because no, and in fact, sometimes there would be these weird codes that would be super obscure, and then people on the internet are collecting these codes, and then they would be able to figure out when the disgorgement roughly was from the code on the bottle. But here's the problem. Even with vintage champagne, it's not all disgorged at the same time. And there are reasons for that, mostly related
months?
to, could be years.
Could be years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is something some people don't understand. So let's take Charles Heidsieck again. 2012 Charles Heidsieck, an excellent champagne that I discuss in my book. It's not as if they disgorge every bottle they have on the same day or anywhere close to that. And you could see there's some practical reasons for that, right? Inventory control and sales. So it's disgorged over a series of months or years. And so, again, if you don't have the disgorgement date, you just don't know what's going on with that particular bottle. And it's really, really annoying. And fortunately, more producers are putting either the date or the month or the year. Like some producers will tell you the exact date.
Yeah.
Like Doyard, the bottle we just had an exact date on it. Some will tell you spring of whatever year. And I think this bottle gives you the year of disgorgement, right? Yeah, disgorged in 2020. So we don't know exactly when, but fine. I'll live with that. You know?
Yeah.
But
just have some degree of information on there.
But by what you're telling me, I'm thinking I could have 2 of these bottles, and if I don't have that information on them, they could be completely different.
Absolutely.
I want to say completely but noticeably different. I don't know how different, but noticeably different.
Very much so. And again, there's bottle development. So, and there's not only bottle development, but in case of vintage wines, there's development on the lees. Again, so in the example that I gave of 2012, let's say some bottles were disgorged in 2019 and some were disgorged in 2021. Well, that means the 2021 had 2 more years on the lees. Whether that's good or not is debatable, but you would know that, right? And then you'd also know how long the bottle development has been, because that would be up to the current date. So I think it's critical information. I'm not the first person to get all upset about this, but it's a big thing among champagne drinkers. Is there's a push to get more and more producers to put disgorgement
And I think
dates.
about it again, trying to get back to people who are getting into champagne. If they run into that where they get a bottle of this that might not be, pleasing to their palate, doesn't mean the next bottle. Having that information might be able to find with this particular producer, I like it on this year's and this, time after, and then I know what I like from them versus just kind of a guessing game.
Yeah.
Yes, and it also attunes to your personal preferences. Again, if I buy a bottle of champagne today and it has a disgorgement date in 2021, I just know I'm going to hold on to it for a while because, again, my preference is to put a little time there after disgorgement. But if I don't have that information, how can I make that call?
Yeah,
there's no way. Yeah,
and you're an experienced guy in champagne, and that would be tough for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's another subject I wanted to talk about just a little bit about cellaring champagne. How does it change in the bottle? Are there any like date limitations or anything like that? I kind of know the answer to that, but tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So I think the 2 things to know about it are that there are developments in the bottle that you would probably expect from other kinds of wines. So it's in the sense that if you take any wine, you start talking about tertiary development in wines, let's say a white wine, right? You would expect the fruit to go from more fresh fruit to more dried fruit, for example, right? And you would look to these characteristics in a white wine. You might start to pick up more savory elements, mushroom, something like that, in a bottle-aged white wine. And with champagne, very similar things go on. Maybe not identical to other white wines, but the concept is similar. A rosé champagne with the fruit, definitely you can notice the fruit character.
Oh, yeah.
Going from really fresh, bright fruit to more dried out fruit. Fresh flowers to dried flowers, that sort of thing. So there's that part of it. And again, to me, it's a matter of preferences. So rosé champagne is marketed as a thing you open tonight because there's all this fresh fruit and that's what's about it. I like older rosé champagne.
Same, actually. I've fortunately gotten to try some, 15, 20-year-old rosé champagne. It's awesome.
That's what I think. And, but again, it's a matter of personal preferences. Now, the second thing, though, to know, and this is where there are people who will disagree with me, you see some people talking about how there's a bottle of champagne that's very old and it's still not ready. We gotta wait another 5-10 years to open this. Here's the problem I have with that. So I have a personal rule of thumb that obviously is not scientific whatsoever. This is my experience, is that, and another reason to know disgorgement dates is I want to open a bottle of champagne no later than 20 years after disgorgement. That's just my rule of thumb. And the reason is that, so the corks in champagne, as we noticed, here's the cork here. So this is a very young cork that we just pulled out of this bottle. And you notice how big, I'll never be able to put this back in the bottle, right? It's expanded. When they put these in, they compress them down, put them in, and then they fit within the bottle. And the point is that we don't want to lose carbon dioxide, right? There is going to be an exchange. The cork is permeable, right?
Yeah.
Oxygen's coming in, carbon dioxide is going out to some extent. So if you, in theory, what you should expect if you open an older bottle of champagne, frankly, is less carbon dioxide than you would expect from this one, for example, right? So,
And is that okay?
well, it's fine, and I think it's totally fine. And I've opened up older bottles of champagne. What you'll notice with a cork is it's interesting. So we look at this cork. I know that you can't see it, but it kind of looks like a skirt. See how it's coming out like a skirt? Yeah. If you open an older bottle of champagne, you'll notice it more looks like a peg.
Oh, really?
And that's because there's mechanical fatigue on this cork over time with the pressure, and now it's become like a peg.
Okay.
Now, if you pull this out and it's a really thin peg, what does that mean? It means the seal is not tight anymore,
Right.
and
A lot of oxygen.
oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide going out at a rate that's too fast, right? So what is really disappointing, it's happened to me many times, and it's simply a risk of buying champagne, is that I'll pull out a cork of an older champagne, it'll be super compressed into a small peg, and I'll notice two things. It's very oxidative to the point of being oxidized, and it won't have a lot of bubbles. And that's not fun. And I don't want to have that. So there's no way to know that unless you pull the cork. There's no, temperature gauge where you can jam into the bottle.
Yeah.
Like it's not like a meat. So I've just come up with this 20-year rule of thumb. Just my own personal rule.
See,
but
I never thought about the aging of champagne in that way. And I'm glad I've learned that, because I thought about, when you think about just kind of the general rule of red wine, more tannins typically, can age longer than a white wine. White wines, Sauvignon Blanc or something you're going to drink maybe 2 to 5 years versus letting it sit for 15 years. Some champagne's being made from that white wine or red wine juice that doesn't have the tannins in it, can still age for quite a while.
Absolutely. There's no doubt. It's just, as I say in the book, I say the other thing that's aging in your bottle of champagne is the cork.
Yeah.
The cork is aging, and that seems
what to be your.
Yeah, what you don't have to be concerned about, obviously, with a still wine, because there isn't the pressure like that on the cork. So
No
you can
carbon.
pull a cork.
Yeah.
So that's my thought about it. Again, I
think it's
admit
a
it's
great
unscientific,
Yeah.
but it's my rule of thumb that I developed.
So you're not drinking a
experience.
1998 anything right now.
Well, but again, that's not necessarily the case, because think about it. Going back to disgorgement and laying down the cellars, a 1996, let's say, champagne might have been disgorged in 2006.
Oh.
So if that's the case, and this again, we go back to these disgorgement dates. If that's the case, I've
fine.
still got time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So this is another reason why it's really great to know disgorgement dates.
Can you get it from their websites?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Okay. I will say it's becoming more and more available. When I started really getting into champagne, there weren't a lot of producers who did it, although some producers have been providing this information for a long time. And again, it's not like they don't know. It's not like it's a secret or anything like that. It's really purely that the argument of some producers has been that we're not sure that consumers understand disgorgement dates, and we don't want somebody to pick up a bottle of champagne and think, oh my gosh, this is like milk, it's expired, or beer, because people don't understand beer and dates and born on dates and that sort of thing. So I just think they need to get over it and trust the consumer.
To learn.
Yeah.
I think in
sure.
today's society, that's a big part of getting into these things, is really diving in deep and learning about them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What else you got, Carter? I have something if you don't.
Well, okay. So I want to. You tell me if you want your point or your question asked first. Food pairings with champagne.
Oh, go ahead.
So now that's something that to me is near and dear to my heart. Now I've had to convince
It's
Rob.
pizza. That's it.
No, it's other thing. I mean, you can. honestly, champagne is probably more versatile than most wines.
Absolutely.
No, I've learned that in just reading some things, and so I'll say it on the air. You're right, Carter.
Okay. Yeah, finally got it. But yeah, I mean, food pairings with champagne. I think a lot of people who probably listen to our podcast know how I feel about it. But just if this is the first time you're listening to the podcast, you go ahead and give your points. But I feel like champagne is one of the most versatile things that you can drink with food.
I agree with you 100%. And I know that from both understanding champagne and drinking it with lots of different foods as a practical experiment. So what you have here is a wine that is high in acidity, right? And your typical high acidity wine is going to be good with a lot of foods. And that's just across the board. If you look at low acid wines, they tend to not be as great with food. Something like Viognier, for example, is a pretty wine, but may not be as good with food.
It's a porch pounder.
Yeah. Or before dinner, something like that. I don't want to bang on. I like Viognier, but I'm just saying acidity, it cuts through fat, and it is just good with lots of different foods. And the other thing is, champagne is good with anything that is salty, and we got a lot of salt, and so there's a little bit of sugar in this, and that's the balance there. What's interesting is what champagne's not really good with is sweet foods necessarily. It's like wedding cake, but that's just kind of a traditional thing. But I will say this too. The other thing about pairing champagne and food is that we don't be able to taste all these different kinds of champagnes, but when you look at different champagnes, they pair differently with food. So just to take the first one we had, the Blanc de Blancs, I mean, that to me is something like, maybe that's more of an aperitif, nuts and cheeses and things like that, but also, anything fried foods, French fries, fried chicken, and anything that you would get that really salty fried course to, a Blanc de Blancs would be great. Frankly, any champagne would be great. But now when you get into some weird food pairings that are just surprisingly interesting. So a Blanc de Noir. So now we've got, let's say, 100% Pinot Noir, but made into a white wine. But still, it's going to have that body and structure to it. This is where I have those with steaks. Yeah. And people are surprised, but try it. Yeah. Just try, put aside, I'm not saying, by the way, that I don't also have, Cabernet with steaks. I do,
Sure.
But if you just try it, you will see that it's an amazing pairing. And then rosé champagne is just incredibly versatile because now you've got all the best of both worlds, right? You got the skin contact and you've got a little bit of tannin, not really much, but you've got more body to it. Cheeseburgers, pretty much any kind of pork, anything you want to do that's savory, rosé champagne.
One for you. Big fan of Asian food, kind of a little spice on it.
Yeah.
Champagne go with that?
Absolutely, yeah. Now, I typically, with Asian food, I typically will have more sweet Rieslings. Okay. But that's just because I really like the sweetness to cut through. But it definitely goes with it. Champagne goes with it. But again, this is where we get into the diversity of these wines. There are some, like, for example, Ruhland Blanc de Blanc, I think that's more of your aperitif champagne. Yeah. But anything that's got more structure to it and body and any kind of roundness to like this champagne, for example. I mean, this champagne has enough to it that I think to hold up to any kind of meal. Sure. I just have it with a meal. But people don't, it's more of a cultural thing. That's the thing. It's not really about the wine. It's just a cultural thing. We have put champagne in this box of it's for celebrations and it's for toasting, and maybe it's an aperitif. It's the first thing you do. But my point about that is that's simply an artifact of culture. It's not really the wine's fault. That's just what we've done.
do the winemakers of Champagne make their wines thinking about food as part of it? I mean, you hear a lot.
Some do, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there are definitely gastronomic champagnes makers that say, like for example, Clos de Gauisse is a very full-bodied, powerful champagne, and if you go to their marketing materials, they say this is gastronomic. Like have this with food, and you can understand why. It's almost too much for an aperitif. Yeah. It's almost too big for that situation. It's like, I don't know about you, but like I don't before dinner get a big bold red wine and have it. You know, it's just like I need food.
Yes.
You know, it doesn't make sense. Clos de Gauisse is really great with food because it's big. It's a big champagne.
I have two more topics that I want to mention and have you talk about. I think people who don't know and are learning about champagne see Brut on the label and might think that has something to do with, quality or something like that. It doesn't. Talk about, and there's different levels of that, I think. So go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
It doesn't have anything to do with quality. This goes back to our conversation about dosage and the amount of sugar. So it's very confusing because these terms are overlapping. But here's the basic layout that you'll see. You will see Brut. That means the champagne has somewhere between 0 to 12 grams per liter of sugar, which is a pretty big range if you think about it. Because like this, I don't know if this says, I think this doesn't say on it.
The last bottle was 4 grams.
Was 4, right. So what was interesting about that last bottle is it was 4 and it said Brut, which is accurate because it's in the range. But extra Brut is 0 to 6. So there's this overlapping category. So they could have labeled it, they had their choice to label it Brut or extra Brut, and for whatever reason, they labeled it Brut. And then Brut Nature is 0 dosage. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of other labels, demi-sec and sec, but those are the sweet wines, and we don't have to pay attention as much to them unless you really want to dive into them. But then what you're going to see Brut, extra Brut, and you're going to see Brut Nature, and this will tell you something about style, not quality.
Yeah. So one thing that, and I don't want to get into sweet wines or anything, but one thing that I know is that sec means like sweet, I think, and then demi-sec means half as sweet.
Yeah, it's that's the thing that the names. That's why I say in my book. I say in my book is like there's actually a disadvantage to understanding the French language here because they don't line up in an order that you would think they would. So that's why I just say in my book, if there is sec anywhere in the word in the label, it means there's going to be some perceptible sweetness. If there's Brut, then here's the 3 levels.
Yeah.
And really, most champagne is dry or off dry.
Yeah.
I would consider this, even though it's probably got 8 grams of sugar, I would consider this dry. I find some others around that range off dry, but that's really a matter of your personal taste and palate. But really, the fact is that the trend is for dry but balanced champagne. And that's, when you get into 0 dosage champagnes, there are some of those that are balanced and some that are not, frankly.
Yeah.
Because if you're just going to stick the number and make it 0, maybe that number works, maybe it doesn't. But you can't do what, Charles Heidsieck does here is adjust it and figure out what's best for that particular champagne.
To me, like I could just, I've never had any of those, so like I really don't know. But I can imagine some being just brutally acidic.
They are, and it's interesting because what I discuss in the book is that I think there are some 0 dosage champagnes that are outstanding, but those are the ones that, for the most part, were built that way from the ground up. In other words, there was super ripe fruit, and 0 is just the appropriate number for that particular champagne because the fruit's so ripe, and they don't need any dosage to balance it. There are others where it's like somebody's trying to make a point, you know?
Yeah.
They're trying to make a point, a marketing point. I had one recently, and it was somebody asked me, what do you think of this? And she was somebody who was interested in this particular champagne, and I tried. I said, you know what? They did a really great job with this champagne right up until the time they decided to make it no dosage. This could use a small amount of dosage. But unfortunately, it's become so trendy. Like zero dosage is a thing. And some people think it means it's healthier or it's better in some way. Neither of which are true. Exactly. I mean, that's the thing. But again, go into your pantry and look at what's in your peanut butter and your ketchup and all these other products. There's a little bit of sugar, and it's not to make them sweet. It's to provide this richness to the foods. And that's why, to me, like this wine reminds me of like slow cooked food, and it's like it's got that richness to it. It's not sweet. It's just rich.
Yeah.
And that's the difference.
Totally agree.
I have this argument with my wife about desserts and salt. She's like, why would you ever put salt in a dessert? And I'm like, because of the balance. I mean, it just comes off as, some of these desserts come off as like clawingly sweet.
Yes.
And if you add the salt factor to it, it balances out the dessert and makes it more enjoyable.
One of the things about wine, I think, a wine can't be a good wine, I don't think, certainly not a great wine, if it's not balanced in terms of its structural components. So if you look at Sauterne, which I love, we opened up one last night at a dinner party. Sauterne is a very sweet wine, but why is it really good? Because it's got high acidity. And that's the balance, right? The sweetness and the acidity. If it were just sweet, it'd be cloying and just gross.
Yep.
So that's what dosage is there for. So it's just why I'm not against zero dosage wines. There's some I write about in the book. I write about Tarlant, and I write about Marie Corton. People who are making great zero dosage wines, but it's because zero is the right number for those wines.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into a topic now that I think is important when you get into champagne and drinking it, even though I know very little about it. I've learned this much. Glassware matters.
Oh, yes.
Yes. I agree. And in terms of glassware, I think I've gotten to the point where the way I feel about it is glassware selection for champagne is more about not screwing things up.
Yeah.
Because there are actually a lot of glasses that can work. I think it's fine to go out and look for the perfect champagne glass if that's what you feel like doing. But for me, I've tried champagne in lots of different glasses, and a lot of them work. The only problem is the most famous champagne glass doesn't work, which is the flute.
Yeah.
And so what...
Do you know what was the thought behind that design?
So the thought behind the design is aesthetic. So if you look at a flute and you pour champagne to it, it's gorgeous because of the sites where the bubbles come up from, because it's narrow, you get this really intense bead right down the middle of bubbles, and it looks beautiful. But I have a book written in 1882, one of the first, probably the first books written in English just about champagne. In this book, this guy says, geez, you can't smell anything in these flutes. And so this is not a new problem, okay? This is something that has been known for a long time, but the champagne flute is aesthetically gorgeous on its own. I used to have a vintage champagne poster that I gave away when we moved because my wife didn't love it, but it was a Tettinger champagne poster that showed Grace Kelly, and superimposed on her was a flute, and like it was just so beautiful, and you got that connection really easily. But they're no good, and the coupe isn't good either for a different reason, an opposite reason, which is the coupe, which also I think is quite beautiful, is really a bubbles graveyard, right? Because there's the opposite situation where there's all this disbursement of bubbles, and you're not going to get very many in your mouth, which is where you want them. So something in between. So we're using today these tulip glasses from Lehman that I really, really like. But there's no problem with just taking your ordinary white wine glass and putting champagne in it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I do at home. I just use a regular white wine glass to drink champagne.
And I when I go to a restaurant, I ask for them. I ask if they don't have a tulip-shaped glass, which typically they don't. I just ask for a white wine glass, and I'll drink nice champagne in a white wine glass and be very happy.
Yeah, I do particularly like these glasses though. Yeah, these are really nice.
These are nice. I like these too.
So that's the simple rule to the people listening is just get a white wine glass, or even a white wine glass is the answer.
Yeah. Yes.
If you don't have a specific champagne glass.
Yeah, if you want to get super nerdy about it, get some tulip-shaped glass like this one. Lehman makes them. Riedel makes them. I think there are a few others if you want to do that. But I like to take the intimidation out of champagne, and it's like so many things in life. It's like you got to have all this equipment, and you don't have the right equipment. You need better equipment. It's like, come on, do we really need to do that to our champagne and our glasses? Yeah, exactly.
So I want to. What do you have, Carter?
Oh no,
because I'm just kind of
No. I'm good. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to go back to the blending part of it. I know in some old world regions there's rules. You have to have a certain percentage of, and you mentioned the base year of that wine versus what you might blend from reserve. Is there rules to blending that you have to have a certain percentage of each base, or is it clear or just purely up to the winemaker?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are no rules for that.
Really?
What's funny is in Champagne there are a lot of rules.
Yeah,
there are pages and pages and pages of rules. But in terms of the blend of the grape varieties, again, there are 7, but we're really talking about 3. You can do whatever you want. You can't. There's certain things you can't do. You can't make a red champagne, right? You can make a white or a rosé. But in terms of the blending of the grape varieties or how much you use for reserve wines, and you could use 0. As I said before, there are non-vintage wines that don't have any reserve wines in them. So there's a lot of flexibility there, which, again, provides for really the exercise of an art by the winemaker.
Yeah. Well, I have a, kind of an off-the-wall question,
Sure.
but it's more of a personal question.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and this is the last one on my list, actually. So, bottles, some of your favorite, some of your just all-time favorite that you like, and then the unicorn bottle, or bottles that you're like, oh my gosh, this is the best thing I've ever tasted.
This is the best thing, or could it be something that he has eluded him as well?
Hey, you take it wherever you want to go
or
with
to
it.
both places.
Yeah, you could do it. You answer the question how you want to answer the question.
So, okay, well, thanks. I appreciate that. So, in terms of the best champagnes I've ever had, it's very hard, I think, with wine to separate the wine from the experience that you had at the moment in time with whoever you're with, as you mentioned earlier.
Totally agree.
So I have to mention that, to keep that in mind. But if you ever get a chance to buy Cristal Rosé from really any vintage, I love rosé champagne, and you said you like, Carter, you like it. Cristal Rosé is very, very expensive, and it's mind-blowing. It will grab your mind, and you'll lose it in that glass, I promise you. And it's hard to really convey that to somebody through a description of, I could give you spices and fruits and things like that, and they're just totally inadequate to the description of what happened. So I think there's definitely, I've had a chance to have Cristal Rosé before, and when I have a wine like that, I honestly just want to go in the corner sometimes by myself and just have this solo experience,
Yeah.
And I've also had some very old Dom Perignon, which was amazing. The other day, I opened a 2002 Paul Roger Cuvée Winston Churchill, which is their top cuvée, and it was just magnificent, just glorious. But again, a lot of that has to do with how it was stored and when it was purchased and all these things. But there's those. In terms of unicorn type things, so you have out there Krug makes a couple of single vineyard champagnes, Clos de Mesnil and Clos d'Ambonay, and they're just incredibly expensive. They're you can find them because enough is produced, but they're expensive to the point where you wonder, okay, first of all, I love Krug. Krug and Cristal are my desert island wines, frankly. But with those, I have a weird relationship with those because you want them in the great vintages and you want to hunt them down, but then you're almost worried that they're going to be disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, Clos d'Ambonay, for example, I mean, the plot is not that different from the plots nearby where there are wines being sold for a lot less. So
when you said you were getting nervous about them, I thought you were going to say, do I want to open it? Because when I do, it's gone.
Right. Well, that I'm used to. It's more like, will the magic disappear?
Yeah.
You know how that is in life with a lot of things where you have this vision in your mind about something, and it's almost better to just stay away from it and let the vision stay there.
Okay, or you have the flip side of the equation. So last night, my wife and I, we went to eat at this restaurant in Houston that has got a lot of hype. Okay.
Deservedly so.
Deservedly so. But it's called Blue Dorn. And I have been, it's hard to get a reservation. It's like one of these type of places, right? And we went in there, and I'm just fully thinking that I'm going to get disappointed because there's no way this place is that good. And it was that good.
That's great. Yeah.
And then,
it's great when it happens.
It's awesome when it happens. So, it's rare. Most times it's the opposite. But in this case, it was right on.
Yeah.
So my wife had a very good question along the lines of the same question that you just answered, but on the other side of it, which champagne was kind of that light switch going off, that boom kind of moment where you went, okay, I need to get a little deeper in? Was there a champagne that you had that kind of put you over to the edge going, I'm going to really get into champagne now? This is really fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there were actually a couple, but Charles Heidsieck right here, not this particular bottle, but they have a bottling called Blanc de Millionnaires. And I remember very distinctly, I bought a bottle of the 95, I believe, and this was before I was really collecting champagne, but I'd heard this was really good, and I put it in my refrigerator, and I took it out, and I poured it, and I just thought, oh my gosh, I've never tasted something that significant. So I'd had lots of champagne before then, but nothing that I thought was so moving.
Yeah.
And it may have been that the conditions were right for that time in my life, but that was one where I thought, okay, I knew champagne was great. I've had some great champagne, but this is one that makes me think I really need to do a massive deep dive into champagne at a higher level.
Well, I'm glad you did. Because now you're making me want to do it.
I hope you do.
Now, tell everybody again, you can get your book, Press for Champagne, on Amazon.
Yes.
Is that the only place, or can they get it in bookstores or anywhere else?
You can get it everywhere, really, that books are sold online for the most part. The book is called Press for Champagne. There's a button. There's a story behind that. There's a Press for Champagne button. I actually have one at my bar over there.
That, yeah.
And the subtitle is a guide to the world's greatest sparkling wine. But Amazon is really the easiest, frankly, way to find it. But I know people who don't like shopping on Amazon or prefer to do something else. You can find it at Barnes & Noble, and you can find it other places if you do an internet search.
Great.
Well, we appreciate you coming on and having the conversation with us. I've had a lot of fun.
Oh, me too.
No doubt I've learned quite a bit today, Carter.
Are you going to drink any more champagne?
Probably.
Probably. Well, I've got more.
There'll be a lot more going into my fridges.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Chris, thanks so much for doing this. We really had a good time.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour
of champagne.